All right, everyone, welcome back to Myth and Magic. I'm still not quite sure what we're calling this yet, but today we are talking about witches. I thought that would be a fun November theme, just because fall is it's still kind of got that spooky Halloween thing going, and yeah, I thought this would be fun, so we're gonna do it. Okay, so witchcraft has been a part of human history for millennia. Um, its roots is embedded deeply in ancient cultures and religious practices. One of the earliest references to witches is actually biblical. So, specifically in 1 Samuel, we have the story of King Saul consulting the Witch of Endor. And what the king wanted was for the Witch of Endor to summon the spirit of the prophet Samuel. This event is thought to have occurred between 931 BC and 721 BC, and it highlights the early association of witchcraft with supernatural powers and the practice of divination. In the classical era, witchcraft was also present in various forms. You had Greek mythology, had features like Circe and enchantresses who would transform her enemies into animals. If you haven't read the Odyssey, I believe, there is a whole section of the adventure where she turns men into pigs. We also have Medea, who was her niece, and she possessed similar abilities. And there's a whole story about her. It's very sad, very tragic. And these mythological figures contribute to the early perceptions of witches as powerful and often malevolent beings. So the ancient origins of witches, like we said, goes way back. In fact, it could probably even go even further than what's been recorded, potentially. Its roots deeply embed within our civilization. And we're going to kind of talk about origins of like in Egypt, Greece, China, Rome, Africa, and Celtic cultures, and how they have influenced us now. In ancient Egypt, magic was obviously an integral part of daily life. Like you think of the Prince of Egypt, the animated film, so good. But you have the two priest guys, right? And they do their whole number and thing, and how it was all kind of like parlor tricks. But in actual ancient Egypt, it is believed that, or at least they believed, that they were performing real magic. They had the god Heka, I think is how you pronounce it. Heka was the personification of magic and practitioners of magic, and often is associated with priests and priestesses who use spells and rituals to achieve various goals, such as healing, protection, and divination. Now, women who practiced magic were highly respected in the ancient Egypt culture and played important roles in society. The use of amulets was also very common, as were spells and rituals, and were deeply integrated in their religious beliefs. In ancient Greece, magic was known as, these words are going to be hard to say, Magia or Goetia. I'll spell it. Mageia, first one, and Goeteia, second one. Now, this was a broad and encompassing practice that included spells and cursed tablets, amulets, and potions. Now, the goddess in Greek mythology who is associated with magic is Hecate, very similar to Heka, at least in the sound of their name. For a second, I got confused thinking that something had gone wrong with my research. But anyway, the goddess was the primary deity associated with witchcraft and was revered as the patroness of sorcery, necromancy, and the mystical arts. Figures like Circe and Medea from Greek mythology are well known for their magical abilities, we mentioned them before, and their roles as powerful sorceresses. They often turned people into something that was not human. Magic was practiced both by men and women, and while it was sometimes feared, because why wouldn't it be? You got Circes and Medea weren't necessarily your most upstanding citizens. Like, they had a reason to be the way they were, but gave you reason to fear magic. It was also sought after as potential influence for various aspects of life. In ancient Rome, magic was practiced privately. It was often involved in rituals and spells and the use of amulets. So we're seeing kind of a theme of the usage of items and also practices. The Romans adopted many magical practices from the Greeks and Egyptians, and magic was closely associated with religion. The goddess Diana was often linked to witchcraft, and there were laws against harmful magic. So now you're getting into some policing of the power. Despite the fear and suspicion surrounding magic, it remained a significant part of Roman culture, with practitioners using it for protection and healing and divination. Okay, so we're gonna kind of hop away from Western-ish. I guess Egypt's not really Western, it's African. But and we're gonna hop back to Africa in just a second. But China, we're going to China for a second. In ancient China, witchcraft was also prevalent, with various forms of magic being practiced for healing, protection, and divination. So you're getting a lot of the same kind of hopes from this power. The Chinese believed in the power of the supernatural. And I mean, if you haven't watched their horror films, I guess that's more, I haven't seen any Chinese horror films, more Korean, Japanese, they believe in the paranormal. Absolutely. And as far as I understand, Chinese are very similar. But they believed in the supernatural and used spells, rituals, and talismans. So kind of like amulets. They use these things to harness power. Magic was often associated with the practice of traditional Chinese medicine. So this is when you're getting into witches using medicinal herbs and those sorts of things. And there were probably more elements to it, but that is where that starts to play in a little bit. And practitioners of magic were respected for their knowledge and skill. So this was an educated form of practice. Okay, hopping back to Africa. Sorry, I just got my bangs made and I love them, but they get in my face a little bit. In Africa, witchcraft has a long and complex history, with various cultures having their own unique practices and beliefs, especially when you have so many smaller units that are scattered throughout the country. Witchcraft was often associated with healing, protection, and the ability to communicate with the spirit world. In many African societies, witches were respected and feared, and their knowledge was passed down through generations. Kind of a word of mouth sort of teaching element here. The practice of witchcraft was deeply intertwined with the cultural and religious beliefs of the people who practiced it, and it played a significant role in their daily life. Now we're going to the Celtic cultures, and in Celtic cultures, they had a rich tradition of witchcraft, with witches often being associated with nature and the supernatural. The Celts believed in the power of the natural world. You get druids from this, right? Also witches, this is what we're talking about, witches, the witches of nature, and use magic to harness this power for various purposes, such as healing, protection, and divination. The practice of witchcraft was often linked to the worship of deities and the use of rituals and spells. Witches in Celtic cultures were respected for their knowledge and skills, and their practices were an integral part of the culture and religious life of the people. The ancient origins of witches are diverse and complex and different for each culture, and there's far too many for us to actually try and go through all of them, but they each had their own unique practices and beliefs, and from the magical rituals from ancient Egypt to the power of sorceresses of Greek mythology, the practice of witchcraft has been significant in human history. All right, so we're kind of going to switch over to now what is more of the modern interpretation of which, at least in Western cultures. Early European history, okay? Very complicated. We have witchcraft, right? It's very complex, multifaceted, and it's rooted in ancient traditions, religious practices, and societal fears. From pagan rituals to Christian doctrine, it has left a mark on European history. So here, origins. We've got the concept of witches in Europe. It can be traced to ancient times. We mentioned a bunch of places it could have come from and integrated into European culture, especially with Celtic culture being a kind of a part of that unit. We've also got the Germanic and Slavic cultures, Norse. They all have practitioners of magic, often referred to as wise women or cunning folk. And these people played vital roles in their communities as healers, herbalists, and midwives. This was all considered witchcraft. It wasn't all just like, I just cast a spell. Like this video. Okay, and their knowledge of natural remedies and their ability to perform rituals of protection and fertility were highly valued. So you have this kind of person in society who was so important. This was a position that was revered, and somehow it shifts, right? You got the introduction of Christianity, and because of the interpretations and translations in the Bible, there gets a little bit of a mix-up from an herbalist to now someone who's casting spells. And granted, this was probably part of the original culture and belief of this person's abilities, but it gets a little messy as we transfer. The spread of Christianity throughout Europe, the perception of witchcraft began to shift. Like you were no longer just a midwife who helped people bear children. You had the Christian church, it viewed pagan practices as heretical, right? And those who engaged in them were increasingly seen as consorting with the devil, even though there was no actual connection there, right? It kind of just became a stigma that was placed on it from lack of understanding, really. There was a lot of ignorance happening here. And this demonized witchcraft, it was influenced by the biblical text because it does mention witchcraft, and in those cases, there were usually some pretty shady things going on, but not what was happening in these cultures. It became very confusing, and it references like the Witch of Endor in the Old Testament, being able to use necromancy, right, to get Samuel to come back. And by early Christian theologians, they equated magic with sorcery and evil, not the natural world that was more of the focus of those who practiced witchcraft. And of course, I'm not negating the fact that there might have been more supernatural elements going on in these people's practices and abilities. Obviously, rituals and things were included, so that would have been more, I think, of what became the turnoff there. We now then get into medieval witch hunts. Okay, we have a whole era of this craziness, right? So the late medieval period saw the rise of widespread fear and persecution of witches because now they've been demonized. This era was marked by social, economic, and religious upheaval, which created an environment ripe for scapegoating. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, is a treatise on witchcraft that endorsed the torture and execution of suspected witches, significantly fueled witch hunts. So this became a problem because you also not only had people who were being very innocent in what they were doing. Granted, there were probably others who were doing more of the stuff they were worried about, but it also pegged people had nothing to do with any of this. The witch hunts of the 15th to the 17th centuries were characterized by trials. We had the Salem witch trials, right? Those were super in America, you at least know of what it is. And this included torture, executions, and it predominantly targeted women. And in most of my research and the things I've watched, it was women who had independence and who fought against the ideals of hardcore patriarch as society, right? Where men were the ones in charge, and if you talked back to them or you just, those were the women who were often pointed out. It kind of became, like I mentioned, a scapegoat, an excuse to get rid of someone in society who didn't fit in the mold that the people of that time had created, were comfortable with, and wanted, at least those who were in charge. And these hunts were driven by the combinations of fear of the unknown, religious fervor, and social tensions I mentioned. Accusations often stemmed from personal vendettas, economic rivalries, and local conflicts. There have been stories of people accusing another family of being witches because they wanted their farm. It got ridiculous. And the infamous Salem witch trials in colonial America were a notable example of this hysteria, although they occurred at the tail end of the European witch hunts. In fact, the Salem witch trials and all of that kind of brought things to a close because people realized that things were getting out of hand and there needed to be more regulation on who was executed for being a witch and how you could tell who a witch was and all those other things. It became problematic because of how common it was. Okay, we're getting to the role of folklore and superstition, and these played a significant role in shaping the belief in witches. We have tales of witches flying on broomsticks, casting spells, and making pacts with the devil. These were common beliefs in European folklore, and these stories passed down through generations, reinforcing the fear and suspicion surrounding witchcraft. And the image of the witch as an old, evil woman became deeply integrated in the European psyche. So you move on from just any woman to old lady, warts, like the evil queen in Snow White. And then we've got the legal and social responses, right? So the responses to witchcraft varied across Europe. Some regions experienced more persecution than others. In countries like Germany and Switzerland and France, the witch hunts were particularly brutal, okay? So resulting in the execution of thousands. But conversely, in places like Spain and Italy, the Inquisition was more focused on heresy than witchcraft, leading to fewer executions. You had to meet a certain bar. Despite the widespread fear and prosecution, there were also voices of dissent. Some scholars and theologians, such as Reginald Scott and Johann Weyer, I think I said that last one right, challenged the validity of witch hunts and argued against the existence of witches altogether and the use of torture to extract confessions. Because you're going to tell people whatever they want to hear so they'll stop hurting you. Pain is a significant, what's the word I want? Motivator to just give people what they want or to get what you want from people. Witchcraft in early Europe is a testament to the power of fear, superstition, and the human need to find explanations for the unknown. You had to blame the lady down the road of witchcraft because your crops were eaten by a bunch of bugs when they were just eaten by a bunch of bugs. I have a garden now. Crickets, you guys. Crickets. The witch hunts of the medieval and early modern periods were a dark chapter in European history, and it reflects the complex interplay of religion and culture and societal tension. And understanding the history of witchcraft in Europe provides valuable insights into the ways in which societies react to fear and uncertainty, and the lasting impact of these reactions on cultural and historical narratives, right? Because there are some people who still have pagan beliefs and some people who practice witchcraft. There's Like you can find them on TikTok. I think it's called Witch Talk, Instagram. There are people out there who legitimately practice witchcraft, and I don't know enough about any of that to really delve into it, but it is still a practice that is happening, but it's really been kind of removed from our culture and society as like a really integral and prominent part of our society. Now we're going to get into kind of North America and the origins and historical impacts. So we've got witchcraft in North America. It's complex. We talked about the Salem witch trials. The belief in witchcraft was brought to North America by European settlers. I'm sure that Native Americans had their own version of this. You've got, either wise men and shamans and things like that, but we're talking about Europeans. So this was brought, of course, by European settlers, particularly the Puritans, who arrived in the New World in the 17th century. And these settlers carried with them the superstitions and fears of witchcraft and that were prevalent in Europe at the time from which they had just come from. This was a part of their everyday life. So of course, it would come with them. And the Puritans in particular viewed witchcraft as a sinister practice that threatened their moral and religious order. And this belief was rooted in the Christian doctrine that associated witchcraft with the devil and heresy. And the first recorded witchcraft trial in North America took place in 1647 in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where a woman named Margaret Jones was accused of practicing witchcraft and was executed. And this set a precedent for future witch hunts and trials in the region. There's the play, I believe it's a play, The Crucible, where you have this girl who wants another woman's husband and just causes havoc, accusing everybody and getting her buddies to accuse, and it's a whole mess. So this was a problem. And going back to the Salem witch trials, 1692, okay, it resulted in the execution of 20 people and the imprisonment of many others. We obviously, I don't know, do they still talk about the Salem witch trials in high schools and stuff? I remember that being a point of subject in discussion back when I was in school, but that was a while ago. It's had a lasting impact on American society and the legal system. The trials highlighted the dangers of mass hysteria and the importance of due process and evidence-based justice, not just she's a witch and then you coercing a confession based off of torture. So the legal legacy of the Salem witch trials can still be seen today in the American legal system, which emphasized the protection of individual rights and the presumption of innocence. These women died terrible deaths because of what happened to them. We now have not a perfect way, but at least we have now the innocent until proven guilty. People aren't, what was it that they did so many terrible things to these people they wanted a confession from. It was just not good. The witch trials had a profound effect on the cultural and societal fabric of North America. The fear of witchcraft persisted for many years, and the trials became a cautionary tale about the dangers of superstition and intolerance. So on one side you have people saying, don't do witchy stuff, and the other side being, be careful about accusing people of things they may not have actually done and hurting them as a result. And hurting them has a whole list of what that means.
All right, we're going to actually stop it there, everyone. I did not realize when I started filming this how long it was actually going to be. And I want to try and keep these in 30, 20, maybe 45-minute long videos. I don't want them to exceed that. So we're going to actually split this into 2 parts. And so when I reference part 2 in the next video, I am actually talking about part 3. And that's a video in which we will be talking about some stories concerning witches. So this first section is going to be more of the historical stuff. Next one is how we kind of transfer into modern day witches. Okay, so I will see you guys in the next video. Be safe, be happy, and I'll see you next time. Bye.